All right, so in this section of the afternoon, I'm going to be presenting the final framework, which is what you have in front of you, so it's helpful to have that. You'll need to keep flicking pages, so have it in front of you. So as you've guessed from the online program, it's got a number of sections. They're all aspects of working with allied health assistants that have been identified as areas that need to be addressed, and that's why they're included in the framework. And I'm just going to run you through each of the components, and those of you who've been involved with some of our consultations will have seen they won't be unfamiliar, but they've actually now been finalised. And there's been changes as a result of that feedback, which was very helpful for us. And as was mentioned before, after our afternoon tea, what we're wanting to do is actually start using the framework and make sure that it works in practice in the different scenarios. So that's sort of the application part of the afternoon, which is great. All right. So as I said, there'll be people in the room who are quite familiar with the framework in its draft form, and others who may not have seen it so much before. So it has 8 components listed on the screen there. As you'll see, you may not remember from my bookshelf a few minutes ago, but a number of those are sitting on the bookshelf. Obviously, some of them don't lend themselves to that space. So the first one is scope of practice, and that's the one I did actually drill down to a little bit in the online program. So there are 4 main guidelines. This is just a summary of those guidelines. If you just want to flick to page 14 of your framework, you'll find each of the guidelines components in the blue box up the top of that page there will always be the key guidelines, and then what you find below is sort of expanding that and the content of it. There is also on page 12 and 13 a summary of all of the guidelines for the framework. So that's sort of a one-pager that really shows you all of the content, but there needed to be some commentary around those aspects. So pages 14 to 21, scope of practice is probably one of the biggest areas that people have questions and sometimes concerns about with assistance, so that's why there's quite a lot of detail in that particular section. So the recommendation is that there is a defined scope of practice for allied health assistance, and I think that's probably one of the biggest things that hasn't existed in New South Wales up until now. That scope of practice will include tasks by clinical setting and discipline. And that's the challenge, as Robin mentioned earlier, is that it's a broad range of therapy areas that use assistance and a broad range of contexts within that. So there's a lot of variability. So being able to acknowledge that not all physio assistants will do exactly the same thing no matter where they work, and not all assistants working in, say, rural New South Wales will do exactly the same thing as every other assistant working in rural New South Wales. So there's sort of a variety. So there's a lot of content about options for scope of practice, but acknowledging that there is difference between where you work and who you work with. And then we've linked them to the competencies. The competencies at the moment are part of the Certificate for an Allied Health Assistance. We're aware, and it's a bit like the online program, that that's going to change in July of next year because the Certificate for is having a major rewrite, and that will come out in a slightly different form then. Most of the content, as far as we know at this point in time, I'm looking at the people on the committee with me, will be there in some form. It just might have a different name. So linking the fact that scope of practice, there's training that links to it is a helpful component, so that people don't have to think, well, what training do I need to support this scope of practice? And then the section that I did drill down to in the online program was the need for flexibility to adapt it for particular needs of local services. So the framework is big picture and broad and provides those guidelines, but there are specific needs of different areas in local, out in LHD land and just in real sort of situations that sometimes you say, well, for my particular clinical service, this particular task is needed. How can I include it? And that's why we've given you some structure around how to do that. Any questions on that one? Okey-doke. So the next one's around skills and competency. And if you flick across to page 22, you'll find that's where that section starts in your framework. We'll have very dog-eared frameworks by the end of this afternoon. So in this section, it's around what is relevant, what is appropriate qualification, and what about the other people in that sort of situation. So that there is a list in the framework of relevant qualifications. The certificate for an allied health assistant is really helpful for a number of groups, but not every group in allied health. So it's helpful to know, well, what is relevant, what should we be looking for in our assistant workforce. So there's a list there. A recommendation that our existing allied health assistants be encouraged to have a relevant qualification. And those extra 80 spots we got through DECA are going a long way towards sort of filling that gap within New South Wales. And that the qualification should actually be determined by the requirements of the position. So rather than just saying, you know, someone arrives with a qualification, okay, we'll use those skills. It's okay, this is what our clients need, therefore this is what our service needs, therefore that's what we need to bring in or to train up within our positions. Any questions on those ones? We'll have a long afternoon tea break. The next component's around position description. And again, this is sort of a slightly tricky area, and often people would contact me and say, you know, can you give me a sample position description? And that's been a bit difficult. What is a good position description and what isn't? There's a funny story I tell, because you haven't asked questions, I'm going to tell you funny stories now. I was presenting this sort of content, which is why I was involved with this project in the first place, in another state of Australia. And there was some giggles up the back of the room, and I said, you know, what's the problem? And they said, oh, they created a new allied health assistant position, but HR told them they couldn't have a new position description. So they had to use an existing one. So the closest one they could get was a seamstress's position description. So the ad went out, and the position description that linked with it was for a seamstress, and all these people came quaking to the interview going, I don't sew that well. That's really not what it should be like. The position description should describe the position. So it's helpful that I haven't heard that story in New South Wales, but that's why that recommendation is here. And that also there's acknowledgement that in different positions and different settings there are different components. And we've got a lot of multidisciplinary assistance as well. It's helpful to have all of those things included and not have a one-size-fits-all. The framework does include a template that gives you the option of lots of slot in and slot outs because of all of those options. And that's been drawn from a number of position templates that have been completed before, particularly Western New South Wales, and the compatibility with the Mercury and all those sorts of things, to try and just give people resources so they knew where to start, but also how that can work across a range of areas. And there's the sample position description.